All right, guys, welcome to Derivative Securities Lecture 4. So today's topic is on swaps, and swaps are just like financial derivative contract where two parties agree to exchange cash flows or financial instruments over time. So as we discussed in earlier sessions, swaps are just over-the-counter contracts, and there are two types of swaps. One being interest rate swaps. So for interest rate swaps, you would be having some principal, like nominal principal amounts, and the interest payments will be derived based on those principal amounts. So for example, you may have fixed for floating interest rate swaps, and in such scenario, you may be exchanging your fixed rate exposure for the other party's floating rate exposure. So, and also for interest rate swaps, the principal amounts are not exchanged, and also the interest payments are not paid in full. Actually, you only pay the difference between two interest payments. So if we look back like to that fixed for floating example, you are basically comparing your fixed interest payment with the other party's floating interest payment. And then you just calculate the difference. And for example, if you find that the other party's floating rate is higher than yours, then you have to pay the net difference. And if the other party's floating rate is lower than your fixed rate, you basically is going to receive a cash inflow, like the positive net interest payment. As for currency swaps, as we can tell by its name, it's designed based on currencies. So the principal amounts are actually exchanged, and also those interest payments are on different currency categories, on different currencies. And all those interest payments, let's say interest payment on domestic currency and interest payment on foreign currency, they are also made in full. So there's no netting for currency swaps. Now let's proceed on the learning objectives. So like today, first we are going to discuss the mechanics of swaps, and we are actually going to design swaps ourselves. And also we are going to discuss the role of financial intermediaries in swaps. So basically, the financial intermediaries is going to act as the counterparties for both sides, and like for such service, they are going to charge a commission. And as we discussed earlier, we are going to talk about interest rate swaps and currency swaps. And also, we are going to explain how the interest rate and currency swaps is able to transform the assets and liabilities. So basically, exchange the risk exposure. So as I wrote here, you may be like exchanging your fixed rate exposure for floating rate exposure. That's an interest rate, that's a feature associated with interest rate swaps. And also, you may like exchange foreign risk exposure with like the local currency interest rate exposure. So that's the currency swaps. Then we are going to discuss a comparative advantage argument. So basically, we'll also be going to like design the swaps based on this comparative advantage argument. Don't worry about that. I know it sounds confusing at the moment, but when we like discuss the concrete examples, you guys will be able to understand what's a comparative advantage and how does it determine the design of the swaps. then we'll also be calculating the value of the swaps based on like basically by treating that the swaps are like just two bonds. So basically like the value of the swap will be calculated based on the just the discounting of those cash flows associated with those bonds. So also we will be discussing a little bit about the credit risk. Now let's start with interest rate swaps. So for interest rate swaps, you don't have any initial exchange of principals, but you do have some like nominal principals. Let's say you have nominal principal of 100 mil loans, $100 million loan, and then let's say you and the other counterparty, you guys are exchanging interest payments. So like you will each have a interest rate. So for example, if you are having the floating rate and the other party is having a fixed interest rate, then you will be calculating the interest payments. So you will be calculating your floating interest payments, and the other party will be calculating their fixed interest payments. And we also have this idea of netting. So instead of paying those interest payments in full, we actually only pay the difference. So if your interest payment is higher than the other party's interest payment, then you are going to receive the positive difference. Otherwise, if your interest payment is lower, and the other party's interest, sorry, actually, like if your interest payment is lower and the other party's interest payment is higher, you are going to receive the positive difference. And actually, if your interest payment is higher and the other party's interest payment is lower, then you have to pay that difference to the other party. So that's how netting works. And also so what happens is that you don't exchange the principal, and also you only exchange the difference of the interest payments. And also the cash flows, those interest payments are actually determined in advance. So if you look at this this timeline here, of course, this is only part of the timeline. Let me. So this is only part of the timeline. Let's say we have a swap where the payment is scheduled every 3 months. So for that interest rate swap, they paid in arrear basically means that, so let's say this is month 0, this is month 3, and perhaps we have sorry, perhaps we have month 6. So we have many other periods following that. So that paid in arrears basically means that for your payment on this 3rd month for your 1st quarter, actually the payment, like the interest rate, like the floating rate and the fixed rate, of course, fixed rate is always going to be fixed, but the floating rate will be determined at this point while the payment is made So basically the payment is determined at quarter beginning and payment is made at quarter end. Or you can say that the payment is determined at the end of last quarter. So that's the meaning of paid in arrears. So it's just that the payment is determined in advance for one period. And of course, like if you are dealing with like month 6 payment, that payment amount is going to be determined in month 3. So this is an overview of interest rate swaps. It has those 3 key features, and it is used to basically just converting the interest rate risk exposure. So you will be converting a liability from a fixed rate to a floating rate, or vice versa. And you will be converting an investment from a fixed rate. So basically you're either converting a liability or an investment from like fixed rate to floating rate or vice versa. Actually, you may also be converting floating rate for floating rates. So here it's just give you a sense of like converting interest rate exposure. And the first swap was in 1981 between IBM and World Bank. So here, let's utilize this example to give you guys a more concrete understanding of interest rate swap. So you'll notice that this swap's name is Plan Vanilla. So it's a Plan Vanilla interest rate swap. What Plan Vanilla means that it simply means that it's fixed for floating. So you are exchanging fixed rate for floating rate. We actually have other like various types of interest rate swaps. So for example, the swap, like the interest rate swap, can be inflation linked. So you can see that if it's inflation linked, it's going to be much more complicated than this version here, right? So that's why this version fixed for floating is just called as Plan Vanilla, because it's simple. And also, as I mentioned earlier, other types of swaps can be floating for floating. So you just have many various different types of interest rate swaps out there. And this example is the most simple one, just fixed for floating. And the example here is that you have Microsoft agree to receive 6 months LIBOR and pays a fixed rate of 5% per annum. And that payment occurs every 6 months for 3 years. And also we have this notional principal of 100 mils. Then, as we discussed earlier, we would basically be calculating those like interest payments. So for the fixed cash flow paid, it's going to remain the same for every 6 months. So it's just 100 mils, the notional principal. Remember, this is a notional principal times the 5%, the fixed rate, but it's per annum rate. And we are making this fixed payment every 6 months. So we have to convert that annual rate into semi-annual rate. So we use 0.05 times 1 divided by 2 to reflect that the payment is semi-annual, and 100 mils times that semi-annual rate is going to be equal to 2.5 mils dollar. Then let's also calculate the floating cash flow received. So for the floating rate, so it's basically going to change period by period. So for example, you will be having a different LIBOR rate when you are comparing Mark 5 with September 5, and also the LIBOR rate is continuously changing. So also at Mar 5, the floating rate will become different again. So here, you know that the current 6 months LIBOR is 4.2%. So that's determined in like 5th March of 2001. But you are utilize that rate at March to determine your cash flow in September. So that's why you have this arrow here. Then like the calculation is that you use that 100 mils, again, the notional principal amount, times the floating rate, the LIBOR rate we just discussed. And of course, again, this is an annual rate, and you have to convert it into semi-annual by times 1/2 or 0.5. And by doing that, you find that the floating payment is 2.1. Since you agree to receive the floating rate and you agree to pay the fixed amount, so basically you will be receiving 2.1, that's plus 2.1, and you will be paying out the fixed payment, so you will be minusing 2.5, and the net difference between them is minus 0.4. So that's how we get this amount here. So that's so we basically by calculating this first payment, I already showed you guys this is paid like payment in arrears, and also this thing here, this minus 0.4 is an example of the netting of the cash flows. And also you can keep on doing that. So we also know that in 6 months, the 6 months LIBOR rate is going to change into 4.8%. So basically on September 5th, it's going to be 4.8%. And that's going to determine your cash flows actually in March next year. And now the fixed rates like still remaining being 2.5 mils, but the floating cash flow actually increases to 2.4. So now you will be like, to do the netting, you will be doing like plus 2.4 since you are receiving the floating cash flow. And again, since you are paying the fixed cash flow, you will be subtracting 2.5. And that's like the difference is minus 0.1, and you have to pay the other party of the agreement the money of 0.1 mils. Now let's take a look at this example of like Intel and Microsoft transforming a liability. So what happens here is that Intel has already borrowed 100 mils at a fixed rate of 5.2%. So we have this sad emoji here because Intel actually wanted floating rate exposure. So they are not happy with this fixed rate exposure here. And Microsoft has arranged to borrow 100 mils at a floating rate of LIBOR. So I think you guys should have already known that LIBOR is just a reference rate. And so you basically utilize that reference rate to determine the rates for other financial instruments. And that LIBOR rate, that's a floating rate determined by the market. Microsoft basically arranged to borrow 100 mils at this floating rate, and that floating rate is determined by LIBOR. So it's LIBOR plus 10 basis points. and 1 basis point is 0.01%. Therefore, 10 basis points is corresponding to 0.1%. Again, we have a sad emoji here. That's because Microsoft also don't want this current exposure they have. They don't want this floating rate exposure, and instead they want the fixed rate exposure. So what swaps does is that basically the swap agreement will specify that the Intel is going to pay the LIBOR rate based on the notional principal, and Intel is going to pay that LIBOR rate to Microsoft, and Microsoft is going to pay like a fixed rate 5% to Intel. So that's so like this rectangle, red rectangle here, that's the swap. And then by including this swap, let's see how things change for Intel and Microsoft. So basically after entering into this example swap, the Intel will be converting its like interest rate exposure to a floating rate. So we can see that it's paying out 5.2% here because of its actual loan. So that's why we have 5.2% here. And then since Intel is receiving 5% from the swap, therefore here we are minusing that 5%. So here, since we are calculating the effective borrowing cost, and since 5% is what Intel received, therefore, if you are going to convert it into a cost, it's going to be -5, right? It's going to reduce the cost. So 5.2% minus that 5% they receive. And also, they are going to pay the LIBOR to Microsoft. Therefore, LIBOR is another cost, and therefore you add the LIBOR. And if you do the calculation, you'll find that after entering the swap, Intel's rate exposure now actually becomes floating. So it's LIBOR plus 0.2%. Now let's also do the calculation for Microsoft. So again, we are calculating the costs, like the borrowing costs. So anything they received from the swap will be calculated as a negative number. So first they are paying out LIBOR plus 0.1% for their actual loan. So that's this term here. And then we are minusing the LIBOR because they are receiving the LIBOR from the swap. And then we add this 5% because according to the swap, they have to pay 5% to Intel. Now, those two LIBORs, they're going to cancel each other out, and the effective rate of Microsoft now become fixed, and it becomes 5.1%. Now both parties become happy because they get the rate exposure they desired. Of course, they didn't go for their desired exposure directly, perhaps because simply because those options are not available for them, or perhaps because of the comparative advantage argument I'm going to show you guys just in a few minutes. So for the financial institutions in the swap market, basically just think about the previous example of Intel and Microsoft. So for that example, now instead of like directly swapping cash flows with each other, now we have a financial intermediary in the middle, like stand in the middle. So Intel will no longer directly exchange your cash flow with Microsoft. Instead, Intel is going to exchange its cash flow with a financial intermediary, and so does Microsoft. So acting as the market maker, so the financial intermediaries, they are the market maker. Acting as a market maker, they would require a percentage of the swap value as a commission. So later we will see how that commission works. And also the financial intermediaries standing in the middle between those two parties of the swap contract, they actually has to hedge the risk. So for on the one hand, they are going to have the market risk. So for interest rate swaps case, the interest rate risk, and of course that's always hedged because the financial intermediary is just a market maker. So it actually always make transactions with both sides. Therefore, this interest rate risk is usually hedged because they usually, like when they enter into one contract, they usually does enter into the offsetting contract as well. Then the financial intermediary also has a default risk. So the counterparty may default on their swap payments to hedge that, like the financial intermediaries can enter into the credit risk market. So one specific example would be that they can use the credit default swap. In short, we call that CDS. That's basically, I believe you guys have heard of that before. And the essence, essentially the credit default swaps are just insurance on default events. So basically the financial intermediary will enter into a derivative contract with another, perhaps another financial institution. And that institution basically promise to pay our market maker of the swap. They promise to pay them if, like in the case of default events. So that's why in essence it's just insurance on the default events. And therefore that CDS is able to reduce the credit risk, the default risk of the financial institutions who is market making the swap. Now we have the financial intermediary, the financial institution, stand in the middle of Intel and Microsoft's transaction. So if you go back to the previous example, so in the middle we have 5% and LIBOR. Now the financial intermediary, the financial institution is taking some percentage from that payment as a commission. So here we are basically like splitting that commission between Intel and Microsoft. So now in this example, the financial institution requires 3 basis points. That's 0.03%. That's this amount. And so that commission is going to be split between Intel and Microsoft. And therefore each of them is going to bear 0.015%. So now instead of instead of paying 5%, the Microsoft actually now has to pay 0.015% extra. So that's why this is basically 5% plus 0.015%. Then for Intel, if you look back to the previous example, it's receiving 5%. But now to account for that commission, they just receive less than 5%. So again, now here, since it's receiving receiving 5%, therefore to reflect the commission, we subtract 0.015% from the like the rate they receive. So now instead of 5%, Intel is receiving 4.985% from the financial institution. Now we are ready to discuss the comparative advantage argument. So let's think about this example of AAA Corp and BBB Corp. So AAA is having, so like in terms of borrowing, so this table is a rate that AAA Corp and BBB Corp are able to borrow from the market. So actually the terms are always better for AAA Corp, no matter we are in the fixed rate market or the floating rate market. So it's 4% for the fixed, whereas BBB Corp has 5.2% for the fixed. And also for the floating, AA Corp was 6 months LIBOR minus 0.1%, whereas BBB Corp was 6 months LIBOR plus 0.6%. So it appears that actually AAA Corp is having absolute advantage. So it can borrow more cheaply in both markets. But actually, AAA Corp and BBB Corp, they each have their comparative advantages. So, and that comparative advantage, instead of the absolute advantage, is the whole reason why AAA Corp and BBB Corp are like willing to enter into the swap contract. So basically, the swap contract is able to enable them to access their comparative advantages. So if we only look at the actually let's take a look at the comparative advantage here. So to find the comparative advantage of AAA Corp and BBB Corp, we actually have to like look at the difference between the borrowing rate here. So for the fixed rate loan, the difference between AAA and the BBB is 1.2%. Whereas that difference, like in the floating market, is only 0.7%. So since the difference is smaller, like in the floating market, so we say that the BBB Corp is actually having a comparative advantage in the floating market since the difference is smaller. And also since the difference in the fixed market is larger, basically AAA Corp is having a comparative advantage in the fixed rate market. Now, now let's discuss this further. So, according to the comparative advantage, AAA Corp actually should just be borrowing the fixed rate loan, right? And BBB Corp should be just borrowing the floating rate loan. And somehow for some perhaps company specific reasons, or perhaps AAA thinks that the floating rate is going to let's say drop in the future. So AA basically AA wanna borrow floating, and for some company specific reasons, BBB Corp, instead of borrowing at the market, they have comparative advantage. They actually wanted to borrow in the fixed rate market. So instead of borrowing in the markets, they have advantages. They actually wanna borrow in the markets they didn't have advantages. So that's when the swap contract become meaningful for them. So basically the swap contract will enable them to enter into the market they desire while like still exploring their comparative advantage. So what's going to happen here is that the AAA COP, so without the swap, the AAA COP and BBB COP, just to enter into the market they desire, the AAA COP would be borrowing like from the floating directly. So that's going to cost the firm 6 months LIBOR minus 0.1%. And for BBB COP, since it wanted fixed rate loan, so it's going to directly enter into the fixed rate loan market and borrowing at 5.2%. So what's going to happen is here. So without the swap, you basically just add up those two rates. That's going to be their total borrowing cost. So the 6 months LIBOR minus 0.1 plus this 5.2% are going to be their total cost. And that's going to be LIBOR plus 5.1%. And now with the swap, so like I talk about, so that's previously I was talking about two scenarios, right? So without a swap and now with the swap. So if they did enter into the swap, what will happen is that they actually will enter into the market. They have comparative advantage first. So AA COP will enter into fixed rates market, loan market first. And the BBB COP is going to enter into the floating rate market first. And then what's going to happen is that they are going to exchange cash flows via the swap. So basically the BBB COP is going to pay the floating cash flow. So BBB COP is going to pay the fixed cash flow to the AAA COP, and the AAA COP is going to pay the floating cash flow to the BBB COP. And by doing that, by entering into such a swap, like although they like in terms of loans, they are entering into the market they didn't want to expose to, but by entering into that swap contract, they will effectively get the exposure they want. So AA COP's exposure will be like exchanged from fixed to floating by the swap, and the BBB COP's exposure will be exchanged from like floating to fixed. So we will talk about that cash flow details later. Now let's calculate about the borrowing cost, like the total borrowing cost of the two parties when they enter into the market, like they have comparative advantage first. So basically, the 4% and the 6 months LIBOR plus 0.6%. So if we add 4% with the LIBOR plus 0.6%, that's going to be LIBOR plus 4.6%. So if you compare those two borrowing costs, you'll see that with the swap and AA, BBB, they are entering into the markets, they are having comparative advantages. So here, like for the borrowing cost, we are saving 0.5%. So if you use this LIBOR plus 5.1 minus LIBOR, like minus LIBOR and then minus this 4.6%, that's going to be equal to 0.5%. So that's a total gain from the swap. And when we are designing the swap contract, basically the cash flows will be designed like based on this total gain here. Also here, it's just showing you guys the alternative method to calculate that gain. So you can either directly calculating the total borrowing cost with and without the swap and subtract, like calculating the difference between them. So like what I just did before, or you can calculate like separately for each of the individual. Of course, if you look at the calculation here, actually AAA, when accessing BBB's floating rate, it's actually generating a loss. It's actually paying extra 0.7%. So that's why we are subtracting that 0.7% here. That's just an alternative calculation here. And also for BBB, if it's accessing AAA's fixed rate directly, so if you go back, you can see that BBB's rate was 5.2%, and AAA's rate was is 4%. So if BBB is able to directly access AAA's fixed rate, then BBB is actually like generating a 1.2% gain. So its borrowing cost is cheaper by that amount. So therefore, BBB is generating a gain. So that 1.2% is a gain, and this 0.7% is a loss because AAA is paying more by accessing BBB's floating rate. Therefore, the total gain from the swap would just be this gain, 1.2, minus this 0.7% loss. That's going to be equal to 0.5% as well. So I actually recommend you guys to use this method, like use this total borrowing cost here. Then actually, when we are designing the swap contract, actually AAA and BBB, they are going to split the gain from the swap contract. Like basically, they are just going to like split the comparative advantage from the swap contract. And that comparative advantage is 0.5%. Now, don't forget that we have financial institution, the financial intermediary stand in the middle, and they want the commission. So now in this example, the financial intermediary wants 0.04% as a commission. So basically, we will have to subtract that commission from our gain. That could be the net gain of AAA and BBB. And then we're just splitting that net gain after the commission. So it's just going to be 0.46% divided by 2, and that's going to be equal to 0.23%. So each party is going to benefit at like by this amount. And that amount is going to enter into our swap contract design. So here, this is an example of the interest rate swap design. So here are the 3 steps I recommend you guys do. So there are actually lots of different designing methods, but that's the way I recommend you guys to do. So the first step would be that you actually like write out the actual loan the actual loan rate that AAA and the BBB are borrowing. So so that's the first step here. Those black arrows. So here, the actual borrowing rate for AAA is 4%. Remember that it's having like comparative advantage here. So after entering into the swap contract, AAA is borrowing from the market. It has the comparative advantage. So that's 4%. And then for BBB, the first step is again written out the actual loan rate. So if you go back to the table here, so BBB Corp is having comparative advantage in the floating market, and that rate is LIBOR plus 0.6%. So that's those two black arrows here. Then the second step, so here step 1 is also written here. So AAA borrows at 4% and the BBB borrows at LIBOR plus 0.6%. Then step 2 is that you cancel out the actual loan. So by cancel out, basically I mean this step, this thing here, and also this arrow here. So what's going to happen is that you basically, like in this contract, you assume that the financial intermediary is going to pay out 4% to AAA to cancel out this fixed rate it's paying the actual lenders. And then you also assume that the financial intermediary, the financial institution is paying out LIBOR plus 0.6%. Like the basically that's the borrowing cost of BBB from the actual lender. So it's paying that amount to BBB. So that's our second step. And the third step is that we work out on what's left. So by working out what's left, I mean that you are going to split the gains, right? So you are going to split the gains after commission for AAA and BBB. So remember that AAA actually desired this. So like they actually desired the floating rate, right? They desire this 6 months LIBOR minus 0.1%. And by entering into the swap, they are going to like generate some gains. So like instead of borrowing at this rate, they are going to borrow at a cheaper rate. And basically that cheaper rate will just be their actual rate in the floating market, in the floating rate market. So which was like the LIBOR minus 0.1%. So that's a actual rate they have in the floating rate market they desired. And now we have to account for the gains. So basically the gains of 0.23% is going to make that cheaper. So we further subtract 0.23%. So that's how we get this cash flow of L minus the LIBOR minus 0.33%. So instead of like borrowing directly from the higher rates in the floating rate market, the AAA is able to borrow at this cheaper rate, which reflect their gains from the comparative advantage of swap contract. And the same applies to the BBB Corp. So now BBB Corp has to pay out some cash flow to the financial intermediary, right? Also, I forgot to write that this arrow here, that's a third step. And this arrow here is also part of the third step. So we are working out on what's left. So we are splitting the gains, assigning the gains to each of the party. So if the BBB Corp directly like enter into the fixed rate market, what the rate they are going to get is 5.2%. So we basically have to like subtract the gain from the swap to make that rate cheaper. So here we just use 5.2%. Minus the gain of 0.23%. So that's how you get this 4.97%. Now let's also take a look at their cash flows or their rates. Yeah, let's calculate the rates here. So actually, if we look at AAA, for AAA, like it's paying out 4% and it's receiving 4% as well. So those two things cancel each other out, and its effective borrowing rate would just be L minus 0.33%. And for BBB, what happens is that this LIBOR plus 0.6% of inflow, this interest payment received, will cancel with this interest payment occurred. So it's paying to the actual lender. So for BBB, what's left is just 4.97% of the borrowing costs. Then for the financial institution, so for the financial institution, it's receiving. So it's receiving 4.97%, right? So here I'm just trying to calculate the commission for the financial institution. So the commission would be 4.97%. So since it's paying out 4%, so minus 4%. And then you also so the financial intermediary is also receiving this L minus 0.33%. So and it's paying out L plus 0.6%. So we subtract that. And since L, like the LIBOR rate is going to cancel with each other out, the end result will be 0.04%. That's exactly the commission the financial institution desired. And also now AAA and BBB, they are borrowing at cheaper rates, and also they are borrowing, so they are utilizing the comparative advantage, and also they are like entering into the market they desired. So now AA's rate is floating and BBB's rate is fixed. So of course you have other alternative designs. So if you don't follow those 3 steps, you can have the alternative design here. So you can see that here the financial intermediaries like commission is still 0.04%. And also like the effective borrowing rate of AAA is still like LIBOR minus 0.33%. So let me show you guys how. So I will just show you guys for AAA. So for AAA, let's just calculate its effective borrowing cost. So since we are calculating the cost, 4% is its cost, and then it's receiving 4.33%. So we have to subtract that. And also it's paying out the LIBOR. And that's going to be LIBOR minus 0.33%. So you can see that the net result is just the same as our example here, where we have those 3 steps. So we figure out the actual loan, and then we cancel out the actual loan, and we then work out on what's left by splitting the gains between, actually splitting the after commission gains between different parties, between AA and BBB actually. Now let's talk about the valuation of interest rate swap. So for valuation of interest rate swaps, they can be valued just as the difference of the values of a fixed rate bond and the floating rate bond. So the fixed rate bond is just valued in the usual way, meaning that we just figure out the cash flows and then discount those cash flows as usual. As for the floating rate bond, so here we are discussing like the valuation of a fixed for floating swap. So basically the plain vanilla swap, of course the calculation will be different if we are dealing with floating for floating and other types of swaps. But here we will be calculating the value of 2 bonds, one bond being the fixed rate bond, the other bond being the floating rate bond. So for the floating rate bond, it's calculated via this trick here. So the trick is that the floating rate bond will be worth par immediately after the next payment date. So I know this statement look a bit vague for you guys at the moment, but you'll comprehend it when we have more concrete examples. So now if you think about an interest rate swap where floating cash flows are received and fixed cash flows are paid, then basically like you are kind of receiving the payments from a floating rate bond, right? And you are paying out the payment of a fixed rate bond. So effectively you are having a long position in the floating rate bond and a short position in the fixed rate bond. And if you think about the opposite scenario, if you have floating cash flows are being paid and fixed cash flows are being received. If that's the case, like this value here will just change sign. So it's going to become like, for that scenario I'm mentioning, that like the value of the swap is just going to be like the B fixed minus B floating. Now, alternatively, an interest rate swap can be valued as a portfolio of forward rate agreements. So so I'm not going to discuss that here, and that will be leave it to you guys for your own study. And it's on the page 187 of the textbook. So today we will only focus on like the valuation of interest rate swap utilizing fixed rate bonds and floating rate bonds. Now onto our example here. So that example is on page 207 of the textbook. So here you have notional 100 mils with 10 months remaining. So basically your swap is going to mature in 10 months. And also you are receiving 6 months LIBOR and paying 7% semi-annually. So you are receiving a floating, So you are receiving a floating rate payment, and you are paying out the fixed. So effectively, you are longing a floating rate bond and shorting a fixed rate bond. So we will just be using this formula here. And also the information we know is that the discount rate we are going to use is 5% per annum. And also the compounding is continuously compounded. So this is important. So because this basically determines your the discounting factor you use. And we also know that the latest LIBOR is 4.6%. So remember that the swap payments are made in arrears, meaning that you know the payment amount at the end of last period, and you actually make those payments at the end of this current period. So this amount is going to determine our current payment. Then also we know that the swap rate is 7%. Yep, so that's what we have already discussed here. That's a 7%. But again, that is a like annual rate. We have to this is an annual rate, and we have to convert it to a semi-annual rate. So here, this is a trick. The trick is that for the floating rate bond, it's going to worth par immediately after an interest payment. So now with all the information, let me show you guys the timeline here. Let me expand the timeline here. I already draw this in at once. So here we have 10 months remaining. And what happens is that we have the payments being made semi-annually. So here, like semi-annually. So this essentially means that our last payment would be 2 months ago, and our next payment is going to occur in 4 months. And then like at maturity, like 10 months later, we are going to have another another exchange of cash flows. So here I'm trying to evaluate the floating rate bond first. So for the floating rate bond, we know that the latest LIBOR rate. So we know the LIBOR rate at this time here. So this is our current time. Our current time is here, and we know the LIBOR rate 2 months ago. And then basically we will utilize that rate 2 months ago to determine the payments, the floating rate payments 4 months later. And the floating interest is actually just this 4.6% divided by 2 to reflect that this is semi-annual rate, and times the notional principal amount, which is 100 mils. And that's going to be equal to 2.3 million. So remember that this trick is that the floating rate bond is worth par immediately after an interest payment. So meaning that after this floating interest payment of 2.3 mils, actually our bond will immediately worth 100 mils. So what we know is that actually the floating rate bond's value 4 months later is just the par value of the bond, 100 mils, plus the floating interest, which is 2.3 mils. So that adds up to 102.3. So $102.3 million. And so we have the floating rate bonds value 4 months later. What we need to do is actually to discount that value to the current time, like to this time point here. So since we are trying to like evaluate the swap at this time point. So also notice that this is continuously compounding. Therefore, the value of the floating rate bond is just going to be equal to that 102.3 times the discounting factor. And the discounting factor is e to the power of minus 0.05. That's a discount rate. And times basically the number of years, right? Actually the negative of that. So since we are discounting back to 4 months ago, so therefore we times 4 divided by 12. So this is the discounting factor here. And by doing this discounting of that 102.3, so by discounting the floating rate bonds value 4 months later back to the current time, we actually get this value, like this present value being $100.609 million. So that's the present value of the floating rate bond at this point, at this time point. You guys may be wondering, like, why wouldn't we utilize the cash flows here, like 10 months later? The reason is that, so the whole reason for using this trick, like the trick that the floating rate bond is worth par immediately after an interest payment, is because those payments are in arrears, and we only know the we would only be able to know the cash flows like let's say 10 months later, actually at 4 months later. So we don't have any information about the future cash flow in 10 months. So and we only have, so since we are at this time point here, we only have information 4 months later. So that's the whole reason why we are utilizing this trick here to calculate the floating rate bonds present value. So for the fixed rate bonds value, it's a lot simpler. So because it just follows a usual ways of cash flow projections and your way of discounting. So this 6% is fixed anyways, right? So we can make cash flow projections based on that 6%. Now let me proceed to calculate the value of the fixed rate bond. So for the fixed rate bond, again, we can draw this timeline here. Again, we are at this time point. And so 4 months later, we are going to receive our fixed rate payment. And also at the maturity date, like 10 months later, we are going to receive both the principal of the bond and the interest payment of the bond. now we need to calculate the interest payment amount in order to do the discounting. So I know it's shown here already, but now let me just expand here. So it's shown here, like the interest rate payment of the fixed rate bond is shown here. So here, again, 7% is the annual rate. And we know that the payments are made semi-annually. So that's the whole reason why we are timing this 6/12 here. So these two terms basically convert the interest rate into semi-annual rates. And we use the notional amount of the principal 100 times that semi-annual rate. That's going to be equal to $3.5 million. So basically for the fixed rate bond, therefore, 4 months later, like we are going to receive 3.5 mils, and 10 months later, we are going to receive the principal 100 mils plus the coupon payment plus the interest payment, which is 3.5%. So 100 plus 3.5, that's going to be equal to 103.5. Then we just do the usual discounting. So we just do the usual discounting. So here, so we are using this 3.5 times E. Then we use minus R, that's so to the power of minus R, that's minus 0.05, and R needs to time T, and like the T here, since we are like, that cash flow is occurring 4 months later, so that T is just going to be equal to 4 divided by 12. And then for this $103.5 million payments, since that's going to occurring like 10 months later, therefore when we are doing the discounting, we are timing E to the power of minus R, that's minus 0.05 times the time, which is 10 divided by 12. So if you finish the calculation, you'll get that the value of the fixed rate bond is 102.718. Now, recall that the value of the swap is just a value of the floating rate bond minus the fixed rate bond. So therefore, we just use that $102.718 million, which we just calculated. So this one, the fixed rate bond. Sorry, actually we are going to use the floating minus the fixed. So instead of using that, in the front, we actually have to use the floating, like the value of the floating rate bond. And we know that for the floating rate bond, its value is this 100.609 mils. So that's exactly this amount here, 100 and so this amount, the minus the fixed rate bond value we just calculated. So that, anyways, so it's also still here. So the fixed rate, which we just calculate, fixed rate bond value, which we just calculate, is this amount. So we're just using that 100.609 minus this $102.718 million. So that's how we get this value of the swap here. That's actually negative. So note that this is the value of the swap to the party receiving the floating. So that's why it's long in the floating rate bond. So basically the value of the swap to the party receiving the fixed rate is going to be the negative of this value. So it's going to be like positive $2.109 million for the other party. Now, onto currency swaps. So for currency swaps, basically we are trying to exchange now, like no longer like the rates on different type of loans. Now, we are kind of exchanging, like the interest payments on different currencies. So, the important features are as following here. So those are those are actually different from the interest rate swap. So now for the currency swaps, the principal will be exchanged at the beginning and the end of the swap. And then also the interest payments are exchanged in full, so there's no netting. So recall that in the interest rate swap, the principal is not exchanged, and also interest payments are netted. So meaning that those counterparties, they only have to pay the difference. So yeah, that's a key feature of currency swaps. And currency swap, as we discussed earlier, is just used to convert a liability or investment denoted in one currency to another currency. So IBM, so here we have an example. IBM has agreed to pay 11% on a sterling principal of 10 million pounds and receive 8% interest rate on a USD principal of $50 million every year for 5 years. So what's happening at the beginning of the contract is that so the IBM is basically paying out the dollar principal and also receiving back the pounds. So it's paying out dollars and receiving pounds principal. And then in the next year, like in year 2002, now the IBM is going to receive receive dollar payment. So this is the dollar payment. And then that's calculated as this 8% of the 50 million USD principal. So 8% times 15 mil, that's going to equal to $1.2 million. And then for the pound, for the pound payment, for the pounds, because IBM agreed to paying out the pounds, paying out the sterling. So that's 11%. And also don't forget that the principal amounts are 10 million pounds. So you use 11% times 10 million pounds. That's going to be equal to 1.1 million pounds. So that's why we have a minus 1.1 here, because IBM agreed to receiving the USD interest payments and paying out the pounds payments. Of course, like at the end of the swap, at maturity date, IBM is going to receiving back its so here this 60.2 16.2. That's a USD principal plus a USD interest. So IBM is not only receiving the USD principal as specified by the contract, it's also receiving back the USD principal of 50 mil. So here it's just 15 plus 1.2. And also for the pounds, like on the maturity date, IBM is not only paying out that interest payment of 1.1 million pounds, it's also paying back the principal of pounds as well. So that's just like 10 minus 10 and then minus 1.1. Now let's take a look at an example to determine like to get a sense of the comparative advantage argument. So recall that when we discuss the interest rate swaps, the comparative advantage argument basically says that even if one party has an absolute advantage, meaning that they can borrow more cheaply in both markets, like now actually in both currencies, they may still have a comparative advantage in one currency over the other. So basically by entering into that swap, those companies, those individual, those parties who is involved in the swap contract can benefit by utilizing their comparative advantage. And at the same time, that swap enables them to enter into the market they desire. So now let's take a look at the example here. So again, to get a sense of the comparative advantage, we are going to calculate the difference of rates in each market for each currency. So here, the two parties of the swap contract we are dealing with are the General Motors and Qantas. So for General Motors, the interest rate in USD is 5% and Qantas is 7%. And for AUD, the General Motors borrowing from AUD would be 7.6%. And Qantas, when borrowing in AUD, the rate is going to be 8%. So yeah, let's just calculate the comparative, let's just calculate the difference to determine the comparative advantage. So here, for USD, General Motors, its cost of borrowing is cheaper by 2%. And also for AUD, General Motors cost of borrowing is cheaper by 0.4%. So apparently the General Motors, GM, it's having absolute advantage in terms of borrowing because it has a cheaper cost borrowing USD and in AUD. But now what we want to determine is a comparative advantage. And actually, since the difference is larger for USD and smaller for AUD, meaning that Qantas is having a comparative advantage in AUD, so the red circle here. And for USD, for General Motors, sorry. So for General Motors, since like the USD, like the US difference is 2%, it's much larger than this 0.4%. So because of that, the General Motors is having a comparative advantage in borrowing USD. Now, for some reason, the General Motors do not want to borrow in the market they have comparative advantage. Instead, they want to borrow in the Australian markets. And on the other hand, for some reason, Qantas also don't want to expose to the AUD, which they have comparative advantage against, and they actually wanted the exposure to USD. So instead of those two rates where they have comparative advantage, they actually prefer the currency that they don't have the comparative advantage. So here a swap will be benefiting them. So will make their cost of borrowing cheaper. So in that currency swap, effectively, although General Motors desire AUD, they will borrow USD anyways at first. And despite that, Qantas desire USD, they are going to borrow AUD at first. And then they are going to exchange cash flows in between each other. Therefore, we can calculate the total cost of borrowing with and without the swap. So if without the swap, so note that now all the rates are fixed. So it's different from the interest rate swap where you have fixed and floating. Now, though we have two currencies, but all the rates are fixed. Now let's calculate the borrowing cost I was talking about. So basically, without the swap, the total cost of borrowing would be that the General Motors directly enter into the AUD market and Qantas directly enter into the USD market, and the total cost for them would be 7.6% plus 7%. That's going to be 14.6%. Now with the swap, General Motors and Qantas are able to utilize their comparative advantage. So now General Motors is borrowing like for 5%. And Qantas is borrowing for 8%. And that's going to be equal to 13%. So we can see that we have a gain of 1.6%. Of course, to design the swap contract based on this gain, we also need to taking into account the the commission of the financial intermediary. So this is pretty much we have already done. So this is what we have pretty much already done. And here again, this is the alternative way of calculating the total gain. So you can separately calculating the benefit or loss to General Motors and the benefit or loss to Qantas. So note that actually this 0.4% for General Motors, that's actually a loss. So since if GM is borrowing at its own AUD rate, that's 7.6%. And if it's accessing the Qantas floating rate of 8%, that's actually a an increase in cost of 0.4%. So that's actually a loss for them. So that actually should be minus 0.4%. And also for Qantas, so if having no access to GM's USD rate, it's supposed to borrow at 7%, but with access to with access to GM's USD rate, its cost is reduced by 2%. So for it's inducing a gain. So it's incurring a gain of 2%. So that's how you get this 1.6% here. So I recommend you guys to use this like total borrowing cost way of calculation to determine the total gain. And then we know that the financial institution wants 0.2% as a commission. So basically each party will benefit by 1.6%, which is the gain we calculated, minus 0.2 minus the commission. And we are equally splitting this net gain after commission. So we divide by 2, and that's going to be equal to 0.7%. Now we design the currency swaps. So the steps are pretty much the same as what we have for like for the interest rate swap. So what's happening here is again that first step. We like write out the actual loans. So with this currency swap, sorry, this is a typo here. This is supposed to be GM, General Motors. So with this swap, GM and Qantas, they are going to borrow in the market they have comparative advantage in. So those two red circles are the markets they have the comparative advantages in. So General Motors will basically borrow USD at 5%, and Qantas will borrow AUD at 8%. So this black arrow and this black arrow. Oh, sorry, that's the first step. These two steps, these two arrows, they are the first step, where we write out the actual loans, we work out the actual loans. And then the second step, so the second step is again that we cancel out the actual loan. So right here. It's also stated here, those step 1 to 3. Oh, sorry. Cancel out. So basically, since GM is paying out 5% for the USD principal, so from the financial institution, the GM is going to receive that 5% back again for the USD principal. So this arrow here is a like the second step, like one of the second step. And also we have to cancel out the loans for Qantas. So since Qantas is paying out 8% for the AUD principal, therefore from the financial institution, Qantas is also receiving that 8% of AUD. So this at 8% here, that's a second step, one of the second steps. So those two red arrows, these are the second step of canceling out the actual loan. And then the third step is that we work out what's left. So basically, the third step is where we are splitting the gains between two parties. So this is going to be the third step, and this is going to be the third step. Let me do the calculation here for you guys. Like, you can see that this is AUD 6.9% and this is USD 6.3%. Let me show you guys how did we reach at that. So we already know that the benefit, like the net benefit for each party after the commission will be 0.7%. Also, without the swap, General Motors AUD rate was 7.6%. So basically, this amount. And actually, via this swap contract, General Motors is able to lower its AUD rate from the original 7.6%. So it's like its actual AUD rate by utilizing the swap, therefore it's going to be 7.6% minus 0.7%. And that's going to be equal to 6.9%. So that's how we get this AUD rate here. So we basically utilize GM's AUD rate without the swap and subtracting the gain from the swap. So yeah, that's how we get this one. And also we can see that for the USD, the rate we wrote here is 6.3%. And to get that again, we use the same way. So for Qantas, if without the swap, if it directly want to borrow the USD, the rate is going to be 7%, and the swap is going to save it, like make its cost lower by 0.7%. So therefore, it's like its USD rate by utilizing the swap, therefore it's going to be 7% minus 0.7%. And that's going to be equal to 6.3%. So that's how we get this 6.3% here. You basically utilize so for these two blue arrows, the third step, just like what we did with the interest rate swap, you basically use the rate without the swap directly minus the net gain after the commission for each party. So that's how you get those two rates. So yep, now we successfully designed the currency swap based on its comparative advantage. Of course, you can have this alternative currency swap design. And here again, you are having the same net results. But one cautionary note is that now, since we don't have netting anymore, so remember that for the interest rate swap, we do have netting. So meaning that any alternative swap designs should be fine as long as they have the same netting results, then the outcome should be pretty much all the same. So it doesn't really matter which design you use. But actually for these currency swap designs, since we are exchanging principals and we are exchanging interest payments, so therefore, actually the swap design, it does matter. So let's take a look at this alternative design here. So I'm not going into the details of this design, but so let's just take a look at, sorry, this is a typo again. So let's just take a look at the rate that GM and Qantas pays. So for GM, it's actually, so since this and this cancel each other out, therefore GM is paying out this rate, AUD of 6.9%. So this is the same as the previous design. But now for Qantas, what happens is that now it's paying this USD of 5.3%. So it's 1% lower than the previous example, but it's paying like like this rate here. It's still the same, but actually it's receiving a less percentage here. So instead of receiving 8% in AUD, it's now receiving 7% in AUD. So those two numbers are different now. And now we can notice that basically these 7% and this 8%, they are not going to cancel each other out. So now basically the effective rate for Qantas would be that it's paying 5.3% on USD plus 1% payment in AUD. So that's what the Qantas is exposed to. But remember that Qantas actually only desire the exposure to USD, right? So if you go back to the table, so we know that Qantas only desires exposure to USD. So here Qantas, an Aussie company, wants to borrow USD. It only wants exposure to USD, but now it's having this extra exposure to AUD. Since we are like exchanging principals and all the interest payments. So that actually is the foreign exchange risk I'm referring to. So basically that 1% is the extra foreign exchange risk. So apparently in this example, GM is not exposed to the foreign exchange risk, but Qantas does, because it's paying interest rate on a currency that's not desired by them. Now let's do the valuation of the currency swap. So like actually the intuition is just the same as interest rate swaps. So basically for the currency swaps, we still have two ways to do the calculation of the values. So one way is again difference between the values of two bonds. And the other way to do that, the other way would be again calculating a portfolio of forward rate agreement. So and calculating the valuation based on that. And actually we are not going to discuss this again. So we are not going to discuss this way of valuation. And we will again just focus on the valuation in terms of bond prices. So again, we are just dealing with two bonds. One bond from the now not the floating rate bond and the fixed rate bond. Now actually we're dealing with the bond denoted in domestic currency, and also the bond in foreign currency. Now, obviously we cannot directly use like the price of the domestic currency bond minus the price of the minus the the price of the foreign currency bond, right? So because they are quoted in different currencies, so that's why we have this S0 here. This S0 is basically converting the foreign price into prices denoted in the domestic currency. So here in this example, we are dealing with a currency swap where the foreign currency is paid. So effectively, we are shorting the foreign currency bond, and also the domestic currency is received. Therefore, we are longing the domestic currency bond. So that's why we have BD in the front, because we are longing domestic currency bond. And then we have to minus the domestic currency quoted value of the foreign currency bond. So this is the price denoted, so BF, this is the price denoted in foreign currency. So basically S0 here is going to be so it's just going to be like the price of 1 unit of foreign currency denoted in domestic currency. So let's say, for example, if we are dealing with AUD and USD, where USD being the foreign currency and domestic currency being the AUD. So basically if that's the case, this rate here is quoted in the sense that it's measuring the price of 1 unit of USD quoted in AUD. Yeah, that's the S0 here. And the BF is just a foreign currency price of the foreign currency bond. So it's effectively, we're just converting the prices to the domestic level here, and the rest is just the same. So you are just using one bond, you are just using the bond, the value of the bond you long minus the value of the bond you short. Now, here we have another example. So it's quiz question 7.5 from page 207 on your textbook. So what's happening here is that you in this swap, you have 10% on 20 million pounds, and also 6% on 30 million pounds. Oh, sorry, $30 million. That's not pounds. This is dollars. And also you have 15 months remaining. And we are calculating the value for the swap contract where we are receiving dollar and we are paying the pounds. So effectively we are longing the bond associated with this $30 million of principal, and we are shorting this bond related with this 20 million pounds principal. So also we know that the discount rate, the swap discount rate is 4%. So this is a discount rate we are going to use in our valuation. Oh, actually we have two different discount rates. So note that we are dealing with two currencies. The discount rate are going to be different for those two countries. So basically it's 4% in USD and 7% per annum in the pounds. So we also know that the price of £1. So here we are just treating the USD. We're just treating the USD as a domestic currency and the pounds as a foreign currency. So here, this is like the 1 unit, like 1 unit foreign currency price quoted in the domestic currency here. So yep, that's the exchange rate. That's exactly the S0 we are looking for. Now let's work out the like the interest payments first, and then I will expand about the timeline here I already draw in advance. So for the dollar payments, it's going to be this $30 million times 6%. That's going to be $1.8 million. So also for the pound payment, for the sterling payment, the interest payment is simply the principal times the interest rate. So 20 million pounds times 10%. So it's 2 million pounds. So for the like for the domestic, so here let's determine the value of the domestic currency bond first. So for the domestic currency bond, the USD bond, like we basically I denote the payment in red here. So so here, since the payments are made annually and we have 15 months remaining, so basically means that our remaining first payment is going to occur here at like month 3. Also I'm dividing by 12 here just to make the time interval be quoted in years. And also we are going to receive our final payment on basically after 15 months. So on the timeline, the first payment is just going to be for the domestic bond. The first payment is just going to be $1.8 million. And the second payment is actually the principal, so which is $30 million plus the interest payment. So 30 plus 1.8. So that's how we get this 31.8 here. Then we just do the regular discounting. So here you need to pay attention that. So I forgot to emphasize this. So for this exercise, you don't have continuous compounding as what we did for the example like in the interest rate swap sessions, like section. So here, for this specific example, we are having annual compounding. So be careful when you are doing the calculation questions, like be careful what compounding practice you are using, because that's going to influence your discounting factor. So now with all these two cash flow projections, 1.8 and 31.8, we are ready to discount. So also it's annual compounding discounting practice. So here we know that the discount rate is 4% per annum. So basically, since this first payment is occurring at month 3. So we are basically just using, so for the discounting factor, we are basically just using 1.8, the cash flow projection, divided by 1.04. That's 1 plus is 4%, and raised to the power of like this number of years here, which is 3/12. And also for the second payment, since it's occurring 15 months later, therefore when we are doing the discounting, we are just dividing by, and also because of annual compounding, therefore we are dividing by 1.04, again raised to the power of number of years, which would be 15 divided by 12. So we basically adding those two present values. So we are like, for these two terms, we are just discounting these two projections back to the time, back to the current time, right? So back to here. And we just sum those two present values together. That's going to be equal to the like the value of like the domestic currency price today. The domestic currency bond price today. And then for the BF, that's a foreign currency bond price. And in this specific example, that's the price of the bond denoted in, like quoted in the pounds. So we already know that the interest, so as usual, we do the cash flow projections first. So we know that in 3 months, so it's denoted in blue here, in 3 months, the interest payment is going to be £2 million. And after 15 months, so now we are not only paying, so now we are not only paying the principal, we are also paying the interest payment. So therefore, it's going to be 20, the principal, plus 2. So all we need to do is that we are going to, so with those projections, all we need to do then is that we discount it back again to the current time. So to this point in time here. Again, we utilize like the discount rate, but now note that we have to use the discount rate of pounds. So it's no longer 4%, it's 7%. So for these £2 million payment in 3 months, that's going to be discounted as £2 million divided by 1.07 raised to the power of number of years. That's 3/12. And also for the like for the second cash flow projection, you just use this £22 million divided by 1.07, again raised to the power of number of years, and that number of years would be 15 divided by 12. So that's how you get this value of the foreign currency bond here. So it's 22.182. Also, we already know that S0 is this amount. So now we are ready to calculate the value of the swap. So since here we are, remember, we are receiving the domestic currency. We are receiving the USD, and we are paying out the pounds. Therefore, we just directly use this formula from the previous slides. So which effectively means that we are longing the domestic currency bond and shorting the foreign currency bond. So the value of the swap is just going to be equal to BD, since we are longing the domestic currency bond, and minus So S0 here to convert the price levels, S0 times, basically here, because we are shorting the foreign currency bonds, so we are minusing its price. So minus S0 times BF. Therefore, we are just going to be end up with 32.081 minus 1.85 times 22.182. That's going to be equal to, let me do the calculation here. Yeah. So according to my calculation, it's going to be equal to minus 8.9557. So yeah, pretty much the same as this amount here. So approximately it's minus $8.976 million. So remember that we are receiving USD, right? So like this negative number we calculated here, that's the value for the party who's receiving the USD. Now for the other party who's paying the USD, that value should be positive. So basically, you just take negative sign of this negative number. That's going to be the value of the other party. So here, I have a few more tips on the credit. So this is last page, and I have a few more tips on the credit default. On the credit risk or the default risk. So credit risk, it's arising from the possibility of default by the counterparties. So it's a possibility of default by the counterparty, basically by the other party. So also, one thing I want you guys to know is that a swap actually is worth 0 initially. So I know that I showed you guys how to calculate the valuation. Actually, you are going to have positive or negative values as time goes by. Actually, at the start, when the contract is initiated, the swap should be worth 0, just similar to a forward contract. So yeah. And also about the credit risk. So the financial institutions, they are actually exposed to credit risk only when the swap value is positive. Do you guys still remember the definition about default risk or credit risk? It's a possibility of a default by the counterparty, right? So if your contract is having a negative value, meaning that you have to pay the other party, basically this means that you don't have to worry about that the other party is going to default on the payment to you because you don't receive any payment. You're actually the one who is paying all the payment. So yeah, therefore that's why we have this bullet point here. So it's just saying that you like the financial institutions will only be exposed to the credit risk if their swap contract is having positive value. Like if the expect to receive net positive payment. Also like when the swap value is negative to a certain financial institution, actually if the other counterparty, since for the counterparty of that financial institution, its swap value is positive. So if this counterparty is worried about that the financial institution might default, they actually the counterparty, to avoid the credit risk, they are actually going to they can maybe try to sell the contract to directly profit from the positive value of the contract. Then for the potential losses, like from the defaults on swaps, those losses, like by the design of the swap contract, should be much less than the losses from the defaults on the loans with the same principal. And also, furthermore, remember that the currency swaps are like basically for currency swaps, there's no netting. And for interest rate swaps, there is netting. So basically, because of that netting feature, interest rate swaps is going to have like less default risk than the currency swaps because like for the interest rate swaps, the losses at maximum is just going to be like the net interest payments, while for currency swaps, it's going to generate greater losses because like there's like full amount of interest payment involved, and also there's principal amount involved. Yeah, that's all the content for this lecture. Thank you, guys.